controversial issue today, and that is the topic of the anti-vaccination movement and what dangers it will pose for us in the future. And what I want to do is try to go through many of the myths that many people have seen with the vaccinations and try to break down where they may have came from, and also go into more of the history and known benefits of vaccines in order to give them a convincing argument as to why they should. And the reason I decided to choose this project is, first, for a personal reason, is because as a person who grew up with high functioning autism, and considering one of the reasons that many people try not to vaccinate is the vaccinations cause mental illness argument, that was kind of one of the main reasons I got interested in this topic, because I kind of wanted to talk about that subject in particular, but also because this year has had the highest amount of measles cases in the entire United States since 1994. And as you can see by this graph provided by the Center of Disease Control, we have gone over 800 in this year, and we're not even halfway through it. So it's a subject that I feel is as best as time as ever to talk about now, especially when we are already in possibly the worst time for this kind of issue. Now, what I wanted to say is what my question was is it possible for me to actually convince people who may be skeptical of vaccination to actually try and look towards what we know as benefits from this practice? And what I knew I needed to do out of this is I wanted to give people factual evidence, but something that was easily digestible, something that people could easily figure out, but not take too much of the time in order to go into. But something I knew would be a problem from the outset of this project was people just refusing to learn. Because this is a topic where some people will just be adamant towards their belief and will refuse to even acknowledge your argument towards the subject. And there is also the problem that the area that I'm in possibly is not the best place for this kind of research, because how my community sees vaccination is going to be completely different than how another community sees vaccination. And that's just a fact, and that's something I had to take in consideration when making this project. Now, the first thing I decided to do with this project, and something I will be handing out to everyone here, is to make a series of flyers. I'm going to just go ahead and give you a shape flyer to do like this. Some people back here. Some people may have to share some of these, but now the theme for these flyers was to give a pretty easy description of what a falsity of vaccines were and what we know as a benefit of vaccine. For this side of the page, for this side of the flyers, I went into what is false, which is the vaccines cause autism argument. That is a pretty heavy subject when many people talk about this. I went into how the reason that this kind of myth came into fruition was because of a study by a man named Andrew Wakefield, who tried to link the MMR vaccine with early onset autism. And I basically went into how he had unethically, how 10 of the 13 people who originally helped him with that paper signed off on it, refusing to say that they no longer believe in this. And he would later have his doctorate removed, and his research would be redacted. And then what I went to as what we know is true is how long we have known vaccines, because they are a practice that dates all the way to the 18th century by a man named Edward Jenner, who was one of the first people to create a smallpox vaccine after his investigation on those who had suffered cowpox and have managed to show resistance against smallpox outbreaks. Now, the second side of the page, which is on the other side, this is going into a similar topic, but this kind of goes into what we know is true is how healthy we are now because we vaccinate. And it goes into a list of diseases we no longer have to worry about, including but not limited to chickenpox, whooping cough, rubella, hepatitis A and B, polio, etc. And then what we know is false, and that is what many people like to point into as a reason to not vaccinate, and that's the ingredients that are inside vaccines. Because that's one of the main things that the anti-vaccination movement will point to as a reason to not vaccinate, but they do not point out the minimum lethal dosage. And what that basically means is how much of that certain chemical you need in order for that to be fatal for your body. And most vaccines don't even get anywhere close to that. And and one of my personal favorite examples of this is this image right here, which goes into entire list of chemicals, trying to point this out as like why you wouldn't use that in the vaccine, but then it goes into, oh wait, that's all the chemicals that are inside an apple. So it's like these elements are more common than we think of, but it's just that we know them more in vaccines because they are pointed out more in vaccines. And then after that, I decided to do a test run of, after doing that test run of flies, I also decided to start surveying people online and in person. I'm just going to give out a few examples of the survey itself. Yes. Now, I made this survey to be easily answered, mainly going into four kind of questions, mainly, have you been fully vaccinated? Are your kids fully vaccinated? Which also includes if you don't have kids, because that is a very likely response. And one of my most important questions here is, do you know anyone else who doesn't vaccinate? Which is how I compiled into these graphs. The reason I decided not to make a graph for questions 3A and 3B was because those data was kind of more muddled. And for question 3B, I didn't get enough responses to that question in particular, so it would not be an interesting graph. And for these two graphs of how have you been fully vaccinated and are your kids fully vaccinated are kind of what I expected around my community, as what I expected for the answers is most people went and said that yes, that they were vaccinated, and yes, they were vaccinating their kids on time. But the answer to the third chart here is knowing anyone who doesn't vaccinate was my most surprising one, because that to me shows that people know people who refuse to vaccinate but don't do anything. They aren't talking about it, and they are pointing out the idea of why do you not vaccinate? And that, I feel, is one of the main issues here, is when we refuse to acknowledge the issue, this issue just continues to spread, and that's going to be a running trend for the future, I feel, because as we see, this is not just a new issue, it's been growing for a while now, and this is just kind of the peak right now with how measles has gotten to this point. And where I feel I have to go from here is that I know this is not going to solve the entire issue. I know this isn't going to be the be-all, end-all, oh, I fully believe in vaccines. No, there's going to be people who will still refuse to acknowledge this practice until legal matters are actually put into this place. But for right now, I want to give people an idea of what we know now, what we know is true, and what we know for a fact is not true. And what I feel is if we can continue that path and continue to show people the right way towards their information, we could possibly have a world where we no longer have to worry about this. Thank you all for listening. Do you have any questions?
What is your sample size on your questionnaire?
Unfortunately, I could only get around 50 people for my survey, because this included doing surveys with people in person and doing people online. And unfortunately,
of these people, how many of them were of your own age group, and how many of them were like parents or?
many of them were adults.
Pardon me?
Many of them were adults.
Adults. Okay.
Interesting presentation. It's certainly something that a lot of us are thinking about right now. There were two measles cases just up the street from me, so and I just learned that when I had my measles vaccine, it actually was not fully effective if I didn't have a second dose. So anyway, point being, something that I find kind of interesting about this debate is there's sort of different audiences that you would think about with respect to who you're communicating with. So you could talk to anti-vaccine advocates, or you could talk to really the bulk of people who are basically parents who are just worried, right? And they don't know, they don't feel like they're experts, they're getting conflicting information, so they decide to go the easy route of not vaccinating or going on to an alternate schedule. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how you would talk to those different groups differently.
For the anti-vax movement, that is going to be the hardest one to talk to because a lot of those people are going to be adamant towards their belief as to why they don't vaccinate. And for that, you kind of have to look into what reasons they have and what possible reasons in the past they may have had. Because many people have had different experiences with vaccines. It's not just us in the United States. There's also many different countries who have completely different experiences with vaccines. And this is not just an issue of anti-vaccination here. It's also in in the European Union as an example of a place that's kind of refusing to do this practice, and that's kind of what their problem. For the people who are concerned parents, that is a very important group, I would say, because at the same time, you can completely understand the reason why they're scared, because when you get all this information from two completely different sides, it kind of just muddies the water. And what I just feel is we kind of need to see if we can kind of lead them towards what we know is medically accurate than what we know is not medically accurate.
Do you want to take this research any further?
If I could take it further, I would like to do it in more areas than just the February district. I would like to kind of go into more around the Washington area. But if I could, I would actually try to do this on a much grander scale than I could right here because it was kind of limited in area I could perform surveying and who exactly I could survey to.
Right.
Something I thought what was interesting was your initial motivation around this, because it's kind of interesting, the conversation on autism, right?
Yeah.
Because the anti-vaccine movement really does stigmatize autism in the way that they present autism, and I think that that's a really the perspective that you have in terms of criticizing that and the harm that movement can have on folks is actually pretty important, I think, because when you think autism means a lot of different things, we're actually we all know that this is a complex range of different ways in which that exists for people, and I don't know, I think it's just really interesting that you have that motivation and perspective.
It's also kind of the reason it's like this is the most understand mental illness in the entire United States. It's the most common one. It's one of the reasons why it kind of shocks me is this being one of the reasons that people choose not to vaccinate when they fully know that health that is fully around the corner.
Excellent.